Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The vastness did not announce itself with a shout, but with a whisper, a ceaseless, sighing whisper that stirred the endless sea of grass stretching out to the very edge of the world. For Elara, a girl of 10 whose spirit had not yet been weathered by the relentless sun or the biting wind, this new world was a place of profound and terrifying silence. It was a silence that seemed to swallow the past, to erase the memory of a green, gentle land far to the east, a land of crowded streets and familiar faces that now existed only in the fragile locket of her mind. She stood, a small, solitary figure beside the battered wooden wagon that had been her home for months, its wheels caked with the dark, gumbo mud of the plains and the pale, powdery dust of the desert. This wagon, and the few others huddled together in a loose circle, represented all that was left of their bold venture, a settlement they had grandly named New Hope. To Elara, as she clutched the rough, splintery sideboard, it felt less like hope and more like a tiny, trembling raft adrift on a great, green ocean. The journey had been an epic of its own, a slow, creaking parade of exhaustion and dwindling supplies. She remembered the forests thinning, the trees growing shorter and more stubborn, until finally they gave up entirely, surrendering to this magnificent and frightening openness. Her father's face, once quick to smile, had become a map of worry lines, his eyes perpetually scanning the horizon for threats he could not name. Her mother, maintained a brittle cheerfulness, her voice a little too bright as she pointed out a soaring hawk or a strange, beautiful flower, trying to weave a sense of adventure for Elara and her younger brother, Thomas. But Elara saw the way her mother's hands trembled as she mended their worn-out clothes for the 10th time, the way she jumped at the sudden howl of a wolf in the night. Thomas, only 6, was too young to understand the danger, seeing it all as a grand exploration, but Elara felt the weight of it, a cold stone of responsibility settling in her stomach. And then there was Magistrate Croft. He had been elected their leader back in the civilized world for his loud voice and promises of order and prosperity. But out here, where civilization was a memory, his leadership had curdled into something harsh and unyielding. He was a tall, gaunt man who seemed to be made of the same tough, weathered timber as the wagon wheels. His rules, which had once seemed sensible, now multiplied like weeds, each one designed to control, to punish, to squeeze every ounce of individuality and freedom out of them for the sake of his idea of survival. Water was rationed to a single cup per person per day, despite the nearby creek. Smiles were frowned upon as a waste of energy. Children were to be seen and never heard, their natural laughter considered a disruptive frivolity. The settlement wasn't a community. It was a small kingdom, and Magistrate Croft was its stern, unforgiving king. His most feared symbol of authority was a black leather whip that hung from his belt, a threat that was whispered about but, until now, had never been used. Elara's new life was a cycle of grueling chores. She rose before the sun to grind hard, dry corn into meal, her small arms aching with the effort. She spent hours scouring the prairie for chips of dried buffalo dung to burn for fuel, as trees were scarce. She minded Thomas, constantly pulling him back from the enticing openness, her heart leaping in her throat whenever he wandered too far. The promised land of milk and honey was a dusty, hard-scrabble patch of dirt where seeds struggled to sprout, and the future seemed as thin and fragile as the pages of their family Bible. At night, lying on her rough cot, she would listen to the incredible symphony of the prairie, the chirring of insects, the lonely cry of a coyote, the wind telling its ancient stories in the grass. It was a beautiful sound, but it was also the sound of how utterly alone they were, a tiny island of fear in a vast, unknown world. She missed her friends, she missed her soft bed, but most of all, she missed the feeling of safety, a feeling that had been left behind on a road somewhere, swallowed by the immense, whispering silence. The relentless sun, a white-hot coin nailed to the vast blue dome of the sky, presided over another day of struggle. It baked the earth, drawing the last precious moisture from the soil until it was pale and cracked, a network of tiny fissures that seemed to mirror the fractures growing within the small community itself. The very air shimmered with heat, thick and heavy, making each breath an effort. For the settlers of New Hope, every single day was a battle fought on a dozen different fronts, a battle against the land, against hunger, against thirst, and against the slow, grinding erosion of their own spirits. It was on such a day where the world felt like a great kiln, that a simple, human mistake would be twisted into a crime worthy of the most severe punishment. Elara's mother, Anne, was tasked with one of the most vital and delicate chores, tending to the settlement's 3 dairy cows. These animals were not merely livestock, they were lifelines. Their milk was a crucial supplement to their meager diet, a touch of richness for the children, and their value was beyond measure. And approached her duty with a solemn gravity, her face, once soft and cheerful, now drawn tight with worry. The cows were skittish, made nervous by the strange smells and sounds of this new world, and they had to be led each day to a specific, guarded spot along the creek bank where the grass was still somewhat green and, more importantly, where Magistrate Croft's men had cleared the area of any unknown vegetation. The rules were explicit. The cows were never to be allowed to graze freely. The prairie was a pharmacy of unknown plants, some beneficial, some deadly, and the risk of poisoning their precious source of milk was a risk they could not afford to take. On this particular afternoon, the heat was especially oppressive. Young Thomas, listless and irritable from the stifling conditions, had developed a fierce headache and was crying softly in the family's wagon. Anne's attention, usually so fiercely focused, was divided. She kept one eye on the cows, who were lazily chewing their cud by the water's edge, and one ear tuned to the faint, miserable sounds of her son. She made a choice, a decision that any mother would make, a decision born of compassion rather than neglect. She judged that the cows were content and secure, and she hurried back to the wagon, just for a moment, to soothe Thomas, to wet a cloth and place it on his forehead, to offer a few soft words of comfort. It was a matter of minutes, no more. But minutes were all it took. A sharp crack of a branch somewhere in the nearby scrub, the sudden flight of a large bird, some small disturbance, a commonplace event of the prairie, spooked the lead cow. With a nervous snort, it lumbered a few paces away from the creek, its companions following. In their movement, they found a small, hidden patch of lush, broadleaf plants growing in the shade of a rock outcropping, a place the settlers' clearing had missed. The plants were unfamiliar, their leaves a deep, almost waxy green. The hungry animals, untroubled by human fears, began to browse contentedly. When, in returned, her heart immediately plummeted into her boots. The cows had moved. She rushed to them, her eyes scanning the ground, and she saw with dawning horror the trampled plants and the torn leaves around the cows' mouths. She recognized none of them. A cold dread, colder than the day was hot, washed over her. She frantically led the animals back to the creek, her hands trembling. For a few hours, nothing happened. Hope, that treacherous thing, began to flicker in her chest. Perhaps the plants were harmless. Perhaps her fear was for nothing. But as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red, the first cow began to low, a deep, distressed sound of pain. It staggered, its legs becoming unsteady. Soon, a frothy white saliva gathered at its mouth, and its belly began to swell. The other 2 animals soon showed the same terrible signs. Panic spread through the settlement like a grass fire. The few men who had any knowledge of animals were summoned, but their faces were grim. They recognized the symptoms of bloat, likely from a toxic plant, a condition that was often fatal. The most valuable assets of New Hope were dying before their eyes. The news reached Magistrate Croft where he sat in the shade of his larger tent, going over his strict ledgers. His reaction was not one of shared panic or grief, but of cold, purifying fury. He saw not a tragic accident, but an act of gross disobedience. His rules had been broken. His authority had been flouted. He stood, his face a rigid mask, and ordered the entire settlement to assemble immediately in the central square. The air, already thick with heat, now grew thick with a terrible, fearful anticipation. Elara, holding Thomas's hand, her small fingers icy despite the warmth, stood with the others, watching as her mother was brought before the magistrate. Croft did not ask for an explanation. He did not inquire after Thomas's health. He simply pointed a long, bony finger at the suffering animals and then and this woman, his voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, in a display of willful negligence, has endangered every single soul in New Hope. She has allowed the weakness of a single child to jeopardize the health of all our children. She has violated a direct order, and in doing so, has struck a blow against our very survival. We are balanced on a knife's edge here. There is no room for error and no room for mercy. The punishment for such a crime is clear. He paused, letting the dread build until it was a physical weight on every chest. Then his hand went to his belt and closed around the coiled, dreaded whip. And will receive 10 lashes. Let it be a lesson written on her back, a lesson all of you will remember. A collective gasp went through the crowd. 10 lashes could cripple a person. 10 lashes could kill. Elara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the terrifying reality of Croft's words crashing down around her, smothering the last whispers of the hopeful new world she had dreamed of. A profound and sickening silence descended upon the settlement of New Hope, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the very whisper of the wind in the grass. The magistrate's words hung in the hot, still air, not as a sentence, but as a monstrous, unnatural thing, a poison that seeped into the hearts of all who heard it. The assembly of settlers, who moments before had been a group of fellow sufferers bound by shared hardship, now stood frozen, transformed into a silent audience for a horror they could not yet fully comprehend. Their faces were pale masks of shock and dread, eyes wide, but downcast, unable to meet the terrified gaze of or the stern, implacable countenance of Magistrate Croft. This was the law of their new world, a law he had crafted from fear and control, and now they were to witness its brutal enactment. The center of the square was dominated by a thick, rough-hewn wooden post, driven deep into the unforgiving earth. It had been used for tethering animals, for hanging lanterns during their first, hopeful nights. Now it was to serve a new, grim purpose. 2 of Croft's most loyal enforcers, men whose own fears had been twisted into a fierce devotion to his harsh rule, stepped forward. Their movements were stiff, robotic, as if they too were unwilling participants in this nightmare. They took him by the arms. She did not struggle. The fight seemed to have drained out of her, replaced by a numb, disbelieving shock. Her eyes sought her family. Finding her husband's anguished face, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, held back not by physical restraint, but by the terrifying knowledge that any protest would only bring worse upon them all. Her gaze then found Elara and Thomas, and in that moment, a different kind of terror, a mother's terror, flashed in her eyes, a terror not for herself, but for what her children were about to witness. Elara felt as if she were trapped in the worst kind of dream, the kind where you try to scream but no sound emerges, where you try to run but your feet are rooted to the spot. The world had narrowed to this dusty square, to the post, to her mother's pale, resigned face. She could feel the small, frantic hammering of Thomas's heart through the hand she clutched too tightly. He was whimpering softly, a confused, animal sound of distress, burying his face in her side. She could hear the dry, rasping sound of Magistrate Croft uncoiling the whip, the soft, sinister slither of the leather as it touched the ground. It was a sound that promised pain, a sound that spoke of broken skin and searing agony. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. The men tied Anne's wrists to the post. The ropes looked cruel against her skin. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a whispered goodbye to her children. Magistrate Croft took his position a few paces behind her. He rolled his shoulders, a practiced, coldly efficient motion. He raised the whip, the braided leather tail tracing a dark line against the brilliant blue of the sky. It was in that suspended moment, in the heartbeat of silence before the world shattered, that a force greater than fear, greater than obedience, awoke within Elara. It was a pure, instinctual surge of love, a desperate, protective fury that burned away her terror and her paralysis. She did not think. She did not calculate the consequences. She simply moved. She tore her hand from Thomas's grasp and launched herself forward, a small, darting figure breaking from the motionless crowd. She threw herself between the raised whip and her mother, spreading her arms wide as if to shield her from the blow, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her voice, when it came, was not a child's plea, but a raw, piercing cry that tore through the oppressive silence. "Stop! Please stop! It was my fault. I wasn't watching Thomas. Punish me. Please whip me instead." The words tumbled out, a desperate, tangled offer, a complete and total sacrifice born of a love so profound it could think only of saving the other. A collective, sharp intake of breath came from the crowd. Magistrate Croft halted, the whip still poised high. His eyes, cold and flinty, turned down to the small girl defiantly blocking his path. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and a terrible, calculating light entered his gaze. He saw not a child's brave love, but an opportunity. He saw a chance to teach a lesson even more powerful, more absolute than the one he had planned. The punishment of an adult for a mistake was one thing. The punishment of a child for an act of defiance was another altogether. It would break their spirits completely. It would cement his control in a way nothing else could. A slow, grim smile touched his lips, a sight more terrifying than any scowl. So, his voice was a low, venomous whisper that carried to every ear. The child confesses to negligence and shows disrespect for this court's judgment. She seeks to undermine the law with her emotional outburst. He lowered the whip slightly, his eyes locked on Elara's terrified but determined face. "Very well. The law is blind to age. The sentence will be carried out, but it will be carried out on her. Let every parent here watch. Let every child understand. The law does not bend. It does not forgive. There are no exceptions." He gestured to his men. "Tie the girl to the post." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with a cold, final certainty that sucked the last vestiges of hope from the air. The nightmare had not been averted. It had been twisted into a new, even more horrifying shape. Elara, her brave offer accepted, felt a cold so deep it felt like death itself wash over her as rough hands pulled her away from her mother and toward the waiting post. Far from the suffocating fear of the settlement, on a high ridge that overlooked the valley like a silent, watchful sentinel, the air was different. It was clear and carried the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Here, the world was not defined by wooden walls and rigid rules, but by the endless sweep of the land, by the patient cycle of the sun and the secret pathways of animals. It was in this world that a young Comanche warrior named Kaya moved with a natural, easy grace, his presence as much a part of the landscape as the hawks circling high above on the thermal currents. He was not much older than Elara in years, but his life had forged him into something lean, strong, and deeply observant. His purpose on this day was a simple one: to track a deer for his band, to contribute to the well-being of his people who lived in harmony with this vastness, not in defiance of it. His sharp eyes, trained from childhood to read the smallest signs, a bent blade of grass, a disturbed stone, the direction of the wind, had followed the deer's trail for most of the morning. The trail had led him to this high place, and it was from here that his attention was drawn to the strange scar on the land below, the cluster of square, unnatural lodges the newcomers had built. His people knew of these settlers. They were a puzzle, a subject of wary discussion around the evening fires. They cut down trees without planting new ones. They scared away the game with their loud noises and strange smells, and they seemed to fear the land they lived on, building walls to shut it out. Kaya felt no hatred, only a deep curiosity mixed with a sense of caution. They were like children in a world they did not understand. He settled on his stomach in the tall grass, his horse, a swift and loyal paint named Spirit that Runs, ground-tied and waiting patiently behind him. He watched the tiny figures moving in the square below. The scene was too far away to hear, but the strange pattern of their gathering caught his attention. It was not the scattered work of daily life. They were forming a tight circle, all facing a central point. There was a tension in their postures, even from this distance, a collective stillness that spoke of some significant event. His keen eyesight picked out the details, a woman being led to a post. Then the figure of a man, and in his hand, the long, thin line of a whip, raised high. A cold knot tightened in Kaya's stomach. He had seen whips before, used by cruel men from other tribes or among the few bad spirits in his own people, to punish horses or enemies in battle. But this was different. This was a woman, and she was not a warrior. This was a punishment, and it was happening in the center of their camp, for all to see. It was a display of power, but to Kaya, it looked like a display of weakness, of a spirit so small it needed to break others to feel strong. And then he saw the second movement. A smaller figure, a child, breaking from the crowd. He saw the tiny arms spread wide, a desperate, brave gesture that needed no words to translate. He saw the man with the whip pause, and he could almost feel the terrible silence that must have fallen down there. He saw the child being seized, saw her small form being pulled toward the post instead of the woman. Understanding crashed down upon him, cold and clear and horrifying. They were not just going to punish a woman. They were going to whip a child. The air left Kaya's lungs. In his world, children were the most sacred trust, the very heart of the future. They were protected, cherished, and taught with patience and story. To raise a hand in anger to a child was unthinkable, an act of such profound wrongness that it shook him to his core. This was not a strength. This was a sickness of the spirit. A conflict, swift and fierce, erupted within him. The wise thing, the cautious thing his elders would counsel, was to turn away. This was not his people's trouble. These settlers feared his kind. They would not welcome his interference. To ride down, there was to invite arrows, to possibly spark a conflict that could endanger his entire band. He could simply slip away, back to his people, and tell the story of the strange, cruel settlers around the fire, a tale to reinforce their caution. It was the safe path, the smart path. But as he watched the small figure being tied to the post, something in Kaya's heart, something deeper than wisdom and older than caution, made the decision for him. It was the same spirit that would cause him to charge a buffalo to protect a younger hunter, to stand against a wolf to defend the foals of the horse herd. It was a fundamental law of his being: the strong protect the weak. To witness this wrong and to do nothing would make him a part of it. It would stain his own spirit. He could not live with the memory of that small, brave child suffering while he, who had the power to act, had chosen safety. The risk to himself, to his people, was great, but the certainty of this wrong was greater. In one fluid, decisive motion, he was on his feet. He did not mount Spirit that runs with anger, but with a focused, calm determination. He was not riding to make war. He was riding to make a rescue. He whispered a quick prayer to the Great Spirit, asking for speed and for confusion to fall upon the settlers. Then, leaning low over his horse's neck, he touched his heels to its sides. Spirit that runs exploded into motion, not with a wild charge, but with a powerful, ground-eating gallop that carried them down the slope like a sudden, unexpected wind, moving straight toward the heart of the silent, terrible gathering, a single warrior answering a call for help that had been made in a language of pure, desperate courage. The air in the square was thick enough to taste, a heavy porridge of dust, fear, and the sour tang of human sweat. It was a silence that was not peaceful, but suffocating, a held breath waiting for the world to break. All eyes were locked on the terrible tableau at the center. The rough-hewn post, the small figure of Elara tied before it, her wheat-colored hair stark against the dark wood, and the tall, grim form of Magistrate Croft, The black whip now held not just as a threat, but as an imminent promise of agony. His arm was raised, the muscles coiled, his entire being focused on the act of delivering that first, searing lesson. The settlers were statues, their hearts hammering against their ribs, their minds screaming protests that died in their throats, frozen by the sheer, monstrous authority of the moment. Elara had squeezed her eyes shut, her entire world reduced to the feel of the rough rope on her wrists and the terrifying sound of Croft's breathing behind her. She was trying to be brave, trying to be strong for her mother, but a single, hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The whistle of the whip, as Croft brought his arm down, was a thin, evil sound that cut the silence. But it was a sound that never found its mark. It was utterly drowned out, erased, by a sound so alien and so sudden that for a heartbeat, no one could even process what it was. It was a wild, high-pitched cry that was not a scream of fear, but a sharp, clear call that sliced through the heavy air. It was followed immediately by the thunder of hooves, not the slow, plodding steps of settlement workhorse, but the powerful, rhythmic, earth-shaking drumbeat of a horse running at full, fearless gallop. Before any mind could understand what the ears were hearing, before any eye could fully track the movement, he was among them. He did not come from the trail or the tree line. He seemed to have materialized from the prairie itself, a sudden embodiment of its wild spirit. Kaya, on the back of Spirit that runs, was a vision of terrifying and beautiful motion. He was not a monster from a fireside tale. He was a young man, his face set in fierce concentration, his body flowing in perfect unison with the powerful animal beneath him. He wore simple buckskin, and the sun glinted off a single eagle feather tied in his hair. He did not brandish a weapon of war. The only thing in his hand was a long, sharp hunting knife, its blade a sliver of captured sunlight. The settlers' paralysis broke into a chaos of shouts and confused movements. Men stumbled backward, reaching for tools or guns that were not at hand. Women shrieked, pulling children behind their skirts. It was a storm of panic and disbelief. But Kaya's focus was absolute, his purpose a single, straight line through the chaos. He ignored them all. He did not swing his knife at Croft, who stood stunned, the whip hanging limp in his suddenly forgotten hand. He did not make a threatening gesture toward anyone. His target was the rope. Spirit that runs never broke stride, never wavered. The horse galloped straight toward the post, its hooves kicking up divots of earth. As they flashed past, so close that the wind of their passage stirred Elara's hair, Kaya leaned out from the saddle with an impossible grace, his body extending like an arrow. The knife blade sawed through the thick ropes binding Elara's wrists with two swift, precise motions. The tension holding her upright vanished. She gasped, stumbling forward, free, but disoriented and terrified, her mind a whirlwind of noise and motion. In that same continuous, breathtaking movement, as the horse swept past the post, Kaya's free arm shot out. It wrapped around Elara's waist, and with a strength that belied his lean frame, he scooped her up from the ground. It was not a rough grab. It was a swift, sure lift, pulling her from the world of pain and fear and onto the back of the speeding horse. She landed in front of him with a soft thud, her world suddenly reduced to the feel of the horse's warm, sweating neck, the powerful rhythm of its gallop, and the secure circle of the warrior's arm holding her firmly in place. The entire event, from the first cry to the moment Elara was snatched from their midst, had taken less than 10 heartbeats. It was over before most people's brains had even registered that it had begun. Magistrate Croft stood gaping, the whip now a useless coil at his feet. The men who had been moving to intervene now stood frozen, their actions rendered meaningless. All they could do was watch as the paint horse, carrying its 2 riders, never slowing, never looking back, reached the edge of the settlement and burst through the tall, waiting grass of the prairie, which seemed to open its arms to receive them and then swallow them whole. The silence that returned to the square was even deeper and more profound than before, now filled with the echoes of hoofbeats that were already fading into the distance, and the staggering, unbelievable reality of what had just happened. The punishment had been stopped. The child was gone, and the agent of her rescue was the very thing they had all been taught to fear most. The world, in the space of a few seconds, had been turned completely upside down. For Elara, the world dissolved into a terrifying, breathtaking blur of motion and sensation. The ground was a brown and green streak flying beneath the horse's powerful legs. The wind tore at her hair and clothes, whipping the tears from her cheeks and stealing the breath from her lungs. She was held fast, a firm, unyielding arm around her waist, pressed against the warm, solid back of the young warrior. Fear was a cold, sharp stone in her throat. Every story she had ever heard about the Comanche people, tales of raids and savagery whispered by frightened settlers around flickering lanterns, crashed through her mind. Where was he taking her? What would he do with her? She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting at any moment to feel the bite of a knife, bracing for an unknown and terrifying fate. But the knife was not used. The ride, though terrifyingly fast, was not violent. The warrior, Kaya, spoke to her, his voice a low, steady murmur near her ear, words she could not understand but whose tone was not one of anger or threat. It was calm, almost soothing, a constant sound in the roaring wind, like the rumble of distant thunder that promises rain, not destruction. He spoke to his horse as well, a soft click of his tongue or a gentle pressure from his knees guiding the animal with an intimacy that spoke of a deep and trusting partnership. They did not travel in a straight, panicked line, but wove through the tall grass, following hidden pathways known only to them, leaving a trail that would be impossible for the stunned settlers to follow. After what felt like both an eternity and a single heartbeat, the horse's gait began to slow from a full gallop to a canter, then to a swift, mile-eating trot. The landscape began to change. They dipped into a shallow valley, hidden from the open plains, where a clear, spring-fed creek wound its way through cottonwood trees. And there, nestled along the creek bank, were the lodges of Kaya's people. They were not the square, harsh structures of the settlement, but graceful, skin-covered teepees, their smoke flaps open to the sky, arranged in a loose circle that spoke of community, not of defensive fear. The air here smelled different, of wood smoke, of cooking meat, of tanned hides, and the sweet, dusty scent of horses. As they rode into the camp, activity paused. Men looked up from repairing arrows, women from stretching hides on frames, children from their games. Their eyes were curious, but not hostile. There was no shouting, no reaching for weapons. They saw one of their young warriors, and they saw the small, pale, terrified girl he carried before him. An elder woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles and wisdom, stepped forward. Her eyes, dark and perceptive, took in Elara's trembling form, the torn dress, the raw marks on her wrists from the ropes. She said a few quiet words to Kaya, who nodded and gently helped Elara slide down from the horse. Elara's legs buckled beneath her, weak from fear and the adrenaline of the ride. The woman, whose name was Singing Bird, caught her with surprising strength. Her hands were gentle. She led Elara to a place by a small fire, speaking in a soft, melodic voice, using her hands to gesture for Elara to sit. She brought a gourd bowl of cool water. Elara drank greedily, the water tasting sweeter than any she had ever had. Then Singing Bird brought a small pot of a pale, fragrant paste. With gestures, she showed Elara she meant to touch her back, where the first lash of the whip had left a stinging, red welt. Her touch was feather-light, and the paste was miraculously cool, instantly soothing the fiery pain. A deep, trembling sigh escaped Elara, the first sign of her terror beginning to recede. She was given food, strips of roasted venison and a kind of flat, unleavened bread. She ate, her eyes slowly taking in her surroundings. She saw mothers laughing softly as they played with babies strapped to cradleboards. She saw older children being patiently shown how to track a rabbit in the dust. She saw a group of men sharing a pipe, their conversation low and respectful. There were no shouts, no harsh commands, no looming threat of punishment. There was a quiet order, a rhythm of life that was in tune with the land, not at war with it. The story she had been told began to crumble, replaced by the evidence of her own eyes. These were not mindless savages. They were people. They were family. They were kind. And they had saved her. The cold knot of fear in her stomach began, slowly, to unravel, replaced by a dawning, bewildering sense of wonder and a gratitude so profound it brought a new set of tears to her eyes. Tears not of fear, but of a shocking, unexpected safety. The rhythm of life in the Comanche camp, so foreign and yet so deeply peaceful, settled around Elara like a warm blanket on a cold night. For 2 days, she was treated not as a captive, but as a guest, a lost fledgling that had fallen from its nest and needed care. Singing Bird, the elder woman, became her gentle guardian, using a combination of simple hand gestures, soft tones, and patient smiles to communicate. Elara learned to recognize the word for water, for food, for sleep. She watched the children play their games of skill and stealth, and though she did not join them, she no longer flinched when they looked her way with curious, friendly eyes. The stinging welt on her back faded to a memory under the healing paste, but the memory of the whip's whistle and Magistrate Croft's cold eyes was a deeper wound, one that this place of kindness was slowly helping to heal. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound safety, a current of quiet sorrow ran through her. At night, lying on a soft bed of furs, she would stare up at the circle of stars visible through the smoke hole of the teepee and think of her mother's face, etched with terror and grief. She would think of her father's helpless anger and, most of all, of little Thomas, who would be confused and heartbroken by her sudden disappearance. She knew, with a certainty that ached in her chest, that her family would believe her dead, or worse, taken by monsters. Their suffering was a price for her safety, and that price felt too heavy to bear. Her tears in the night were no longer from fear of the Comanche, but from a desperate longing for her own family and the crushing guilt that they were in pain. Kaya, too, was wrestling with a deep conflict. He watched the small, sad girl from a distance, seeing the way she often looked back toward the direction of the settlement. Her small shoulders slumped with a homesickness he could easily understand. He had done what his spirit demanded. He had saved her from a terrible wrong. But keeping her here, allowing her family to mourn her as lost, began to feel like a different kind of wrong. He spoke of this to the chief of the band, a wise and weathered man named Looks Far, as they sat together one evening. "The girl's heart is with her people," Caius said, his gaze thoughtful. "She is safe here, but she is not whole." Looks Far nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "This is a heavy thing you consider, Kaya. The settlers fear us. They do not understand our ways. To take her back is to ride into the teeth of their fear. They may see not a returned child, but a warrior stealing into their camp. They may shoot first and ask questions never. You risk not only your life, but you could bring their anger down upon all of us. They may see this not as a kindness, but as a reason for war." Kaya listened to the chief's wise words, weighing the danger. It was all true, every word. It was the safe path, the smart path, to let the settlers believe what they would and for the band to move on, to put distance between themselves and the potential threat. But then he looked again at Elara, who was absently tracing patterns in the dirt, a picture of lonely sorrow. He remembered the incredible courage that had made her step in front of a whip for her mother. That kind of love deserved an answer. That kind of bravery deserved to be rewarded with a complete rescue, not a half one. "I hear your wisdom. Looks Far," Caius said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "The risk is great, but to leave her family in darkness, to let a mother's heart break thinking her child is dead, that is a certainty. The risk to me is a maybe. Their suffering is a sure. A life is more important than safety. My spirit will not be clean if I choose the safe path." The chief studied the young warrior's face for a long time. He saw not the hot-headedness of youth, but the solid, principled courage of a man who understood the cost of doing what was right. He placed a hand on Kaya's shoulder. "Then your heart has spoken its truth. You will not go alone. Take 2 hawks and Stone Bear with you. Go with the darkness as your cloak. Return the little bird to its nest. May the Great Spirit blind the eyes of those who would do you harm. That night, under a sky dusted with 1,000,000 stars, with no moon to betray their movement, Kaya and 2 other warriors made their preparations. There was no loud boasting, no show of force. It was a quiet, serious mission. Elara was awakened gently by Singing Bird, who helped her dress and then led her to where Kaya waited with spirit that runs and the other 2 warriors on their own quiet, steady horses. Using gestures, Singing Bird made Elara understand. She was going home. A hope so powerful it was almost painful surged in Elara's chest. Kaya helped her up onto his horse, and with a silent nod to the elder woman, the 3 riders and their young charge melted into the immense, black velvet of the night, moving not as conquerors, but as guardians, carrying a precious, fragile hope back through the whispering grass. The night was a living thing, a vast, dark blanket woven from shadows and the soft, rustling whispers of the prairie grass. It was a world of sounds amplified, the chirr of crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, the steady, muffled footfalls of the horses moving with an almost supernatural quiet. Elara, seated before Kaya on Spirit That Runs, felt no fear of this darkness. The arm that held her secure was a promise of safety, and the purposeful silence of the warriors around her spoke of a focused intent that was far more comforting than any words could be. They were not invaders. They were ghosts moving through a land they knew intimately. Every dip and rise, every solitary tree a familiar landmark in the starlit gloom. They were bringing her home. The concept was so immense, so overflowing with relief and yearning, that it filled her completely, leaving no room for anything else. They halted at the very edge of the settlement, where the cultivated dirt met the wild grass. The wooden cabins were dark and silent, hulking shapes against the lesser black of the sky. Kaya pointed toward one, the smallest and humblest of them all, where a single, thin curl of smoke still rose from the chimney, a sign that someone within was awake, keeping a lonely vigil. With infinite care, he helped Elara slide down from the horse. Her feet touched the familiar, hard-packed earth of what passed for her family's yard. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, trying to pour a lifetime of gratitude into a single glance. He met her gaze and gave a slow, solemn nod. It was not a goodbye between friends, but an acknowledgement between 2 spirits who had briefly touched and changed each other's paths forever. Then, without a sound, he and the other warriors melted back into the embrace of the night, becoming one with the shadows until it was as if they had never been there at all. Elara stood alone for a moment, listening to the silence. Then, she turned and ran on silent, bare feet to the cabin door. It was not locked. There was nothing of value to steal in New Hope except worry. She pushed it open, the creak of the hinges sounding like a thunderclap in the sleeping stillness. The scene inside was one of frozen grief. Her mother, Anne, was sitting by the cold hearth, her face pale and tear-streaked in the faint ember glow, staring into nothingness. Her father sat at the rough-hewn table, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. Little Thomas was asleep on his cot, but his sleep was fitful, and his face was streaked with dried tears. At the sound of the door, Anne's head snapped up. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow with despair, widened in pure, uncomprehending shock. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply stared, believing she was seeing a ghost, a phantom conjured by her own broken heart. Elara. The name was a breath, a fragile wisp of sound. It was enough to break the spell. Elara rushed forward, and the feel of her small, solid body crashing in her mother's arms, the realness of her, shattered the paralysis. A sob, raw and joyous, broke from Anne's throat as she clutched her daughter, raining kisses on her hair, her face, her hands, unable to believe the miracle. The commotion woke Thomas, who, after a moment of confused blinking, launched himself from his bed with a cry of Elara and joined the weeping, laughing, tangled heap of reunion on the floor. Their father was there too, on his knees, his large, work-roughened hands gently cupping his daughter's face as if she were the most precious thing in the world, tears streaming openly down his own cheeks. The cabin, which had been a tomb of sorrow moments before, was now filled with the overwhelming, radiant light of a restored family. The noise, however, could not be contained. It spilled out into the night, and soon other cabins began to glow with lamplight. Curious, concerned faces appeared at doors, and among them, inevitably, was Magistrate Croft, his face a thundercloud of suspicion and anger, his enforcers at his heels. He pushed his way into the small cabin, his eyes narrowing at the scene of emotional reunion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the joy. "How did you get back? Did you escape the savages? Speak, girl." But before Elara could even form a word, a transformation occurred. The other settlers, who had gathered at the doorway, were not looking at her with suspicion, but with awe and dawning understanding. They saw a family made whole. They saw a child returned, not harmed, but safe. A man named John, whose own daughter was close to Elara's age, stepped forward. He had been sickened by the whipping, and his spirit had been simmering with discontent ever since. He looked from Elara's grateful face to Croft's furious one. "She was brought back, Magistrate," John said, his voice low but firm, carrying a new authority. "By the very people you told us were only monsters. They didn't keep her. They didn't harm her. They brought her home. After you," he paused, letting the unspoken horror of Croft's actions hang in the air. "After you were going to whip a child." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, now filling the small cabin. Others nodded, their own long-suppressed doubts finding a voice. "He's right," a woman said. "They showed more mercy than we did." Croft spluttered, his face purpling. "This is trickery, a deception. They want us to lower our guard. This changes nothing. The law, your law, is broken." John interrupted, his voice rising now, filled with a courage inspired by the warrior's act. "Your law would have us whip our children and live in fear of shadows. That ends tonight. We followed you for order, but you gave us cruelty. True strength isn't in that whip. It's in protecting each other. It's in the mercy that was shown to this child tonight." The other settlers, their hearts and minds unlocked by the incredible event, moved to stand with John, forming a silent, solid wall between Croft and Elara's family. The message was clear. His rule was over. The reign of fear had been broken, not by a fight, but by a single, stunning act of courage and kindness from an unexpected quarter. As Croft was led away, sputtering into the night, a new and fragile hope, a real hope this time, began to dawn in New Hope. It was a hope built not on harsh rules, but on the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to offer protection, and that goodness can be found in the most unexpected places if only one has the courage to look for it. If you enjoyed this story of courage and kindness against all odds, please like, subscribe, and share this channel to help us tell more tales where hope triumphs over fear. Your support helps us bring these important lessons to everyone. Thank you for watching.